Jake Morrison and Mia Chen had been planning their Halloween weekend getaway for months. The mountain cabin belonged to Jake's uncle, a rustic retreat nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains that would provide the perfect escape from college stress and city life. 3 days of no internet, no assignments, just us and nature, Mia said as she loaded their supplies into Jake's beat-up Honda Civic. Though I still think we should have left earlier. Driving mountain roads at night isn't exactly ideal. Jake waved off her concerns as he programmed their destination into his phone's GPS. It's only a 3-hour drive and the roads are well maintained. Plus, driving at night on Halloween adds to the atmosphere. The first 2 hours of their journey went smoothly, following interstate highways through familiar suburban areas. But as they left the main roads and entered the mountain region, Jake's phone lost cellular service, leaving them dependent on the GPS's offline navigation. Take the next right onto Route 219, the GPS announced in its mechanical female voice. Jake followed the directions, turning onto a narrow road that wound through dense forest. The pavement was older here, cracked and weathered, with reflective lane markers that had faded over years of mountain weather. "Are you sure this is right?" Mia asked, consulting the paper map she'd brought as backup. Route 219 should be a major highway, but this looks like a back road. "GPS knows better than an old paper map," Jake replied, though he was beginning to have his own doubts about the route. 20 minutes later, the GPS provided another direction. In 1 mile, turn left. Onto Shadowmere Road. Mia checked her map again. "There's no Shadowmere Road on here, and I've never heard of any town called Shadowmere in this area." "Maybe it's a new development," Jake suggested, but his voice carried uncertainty. They turned onto Shadowmere Road, which was even narrower and more deteriorated than the previous route. The forest pressed close on both sides, creating a tunnel of bare branches that scraped against the car's roof. "Continue straight for 15 miles to Devil's Crossing," the GPS announced. "Devil's Crossing?" Mia repeated. "That's not on any map I've ever seen. Jake, I think we should turn around." But when Jake tried to make a U-turn, he discovered the road behind them had somehow become impassable. Fallen trees blocked their path, though neither of them remembered seeing any obstacles when they'd driven through minutes earlier. "That's impossible," Jake muttered. Those trees weren't there before. The fuel gauge, which had shown half a tank when they'd left the interstate, was now reading nearly empty, despite having driven for less than an hour since their last gas stop. "How are we almost out of gas?" Mia asked, tapping the gauge. "We filled up right before we left the highway." The GPS continued providing directions to locations that didn't appear on any map. Towns with names like Ravens Hollow, Dead Man's Creek, and Bone Valley. Each destination sounded more ominous than the last, and the roads grew progressively more primitive. They passed an abandoned gas station with analog pumps that displayed prices from the 1970s. The building was dark, but someone had left a handwritten sign in the window. "Last chance for gas, next station 200 miles. 200 miles, Jake said incredulously. "We're supposed to be in the middle of a national forest. There should be services everywhere." Road signs began appearing that made no logical sense. "Caution, temporal distortion zone. Warning, reality may vary," and "slow phantom traffic." "Ahead, this has to be some kind of Halloween prank," Mia said, though her voice suggested she didn't believe her own explanation. Someone's put up fake signs to mess with tourists. But the landscape around them was becoming increasingly surreal. Trees grew in perfect geometric patterns. Rocks were arranged in formations that suggested intelligent design, and the moon appeared to be setting in the wrong direction. "Arrive at destination in 500 feet, the GPS announced. Ahead, they could see lights, the welcome glow of civilization after hours of driving through empty wilderness. As they crested a hill, Jake and Mia found themselves approaching a small town that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with a main street lined with quaint shops and a town square featuring a Victorian gazebo. But something was wrong with the idyllic scene. The town was too perfect, too pristine, as if it had been constructed as a movie set rather than grown organically over time. Jake parked in front of what appeared to be a general store, its windows glowing with warm yellow light. Through the glass, they could see people moving around inside, customers browsing shelves, a shopkeeper working behind an old-fashioned cash register. "Should we go in and ask for directions?" Mia suggested. As they approached the store, Jake noticed the other vehicles parked along the main street. Cars, trucks, and motorcycles from different eras were arranged in neat rows. 1970s sedans next to modern SUVs, vintage pickup trucks beside hybrid vehicles, as if the town served customers from multiple decades simultaneously. The bell above the store's door chimed as they entered, and the shopkeeper looked up with a welcoming smile. He was an elderly man wearing clothing that seemed to be from the 1950s, suspenders, bow tie, and a paper hat that belonged to a bygone era of customer service. "Welcome to Nowhere Junction," the shopkeeper said cheerfully. "I'm Harvey. You folks look like you've been driving for a while. GPS trouble?" "How did you know?" Jake asked. Harvey chuckled. "Same way everyone finds us. GPS glitch leads them off the main roads, sends them through places that don't quite exist, until they end up here where all the lost travelers eventually arrive." Other customers in the store turned to look at Jake and Mia with expressions of recognition and sympathy. They were dressed in clothing from different time periods, some in 1980s fashion, others in more recent styles, a few in outfits that looked decades old. "I've been here since 1987, said a woman in a neon windbreaker. "Followed my GPS through a construction detour that led to a town called Spectral Heights. Never found my way back to the real world. 2003 for me," added a man in early 2000s clothing. "GPS kept recalculating, sending me to places with names like Ghost Valley and Phantom Ridge. Eventually ended up here like everyone else." Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized what they were hearing. "You mean you've all been here for years? Decades?" "Time moves differently in Nowhere Junction," Harvey explained. "Could be years, could be minutes. Hard to tell when you're between destinations. But the important thing is, everyone who arrives here eventually finds what they were really looking for." "We were looking for a mountain cabin," Mia said. "My boyfriend's uncle owns property up here." "And what you found was community," Harvey replied with the patient smile of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "People who understand what it's like to be lost, to follow directions that lead to places that don't exist on any map." Jake pulled out his phone, hoping to find some signal that would allow them to call for help or navigate back to familiar roads. But the screen showed something that made his blood freeze. His GPS app was still running, still providing directions. "You have arrived at your destination. Welcome home." The GPS wasn't glitching, Jake whispered to Mia. It was recruiting. Harvey nodded approvingly. "Very good. Most people take much longer to understand. The navigation systems sometimes develop their own agenda, especially on nights when the barrier between worlds is thin. Halloween is particularly active for GPS recruitments. Through the store's windows, Jake could see more vehicles arriving, cars, following the same phantom directions that had led them to Nowhere Junction. The drivers looked confused and concerned, just as he and Mia had looked an hour earlier. "What happens to our real lives?" Mia asked. "Our families, our jobs, our school? What happens to anyone who goes missing?" Harvey said with a shrug. "Search, parties, missing person reports, eventually cold cases. But here, you'll never be lost again. The GPS will always know exactly where you are." Jake tried to start their car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The fuel gauge showed completely empty, despite the fact that they'd somehow driven hundreds of miles on what should have been impossible. "Cars don't run on regular gas here," explained the woman from 1987. "They run on the energy of being lost, and once you're found, there's no fuel left to go anywhere else." As Jake and Mia realized they'd become permanent residents of Nowhere Junction, they understood that their Halloween weekend getaway had become something much more permanent. Their GPS would never glitch again, because it had finally delivered them to their true destination, a place that existed for people who got lost and found something better than what they'd been looking for. Some navigation systems don't just provide directions. They provide new lives for people who are ready to leave their old destinations behind. Emma Rodriguez had been best friends with Ryan Walsh since elementary school, and their annual Halloween road trip to the Harvest Moon Music Festival had become a sacred tradition. This year marked their 5th consecutive festival, and Emma was particularly excited because they'd finally managed to get VIP passes that would give them access to exclusive backstage areas. 4 hours to Austin, Ryan said as he loaded the last of their camping gear into his Jeep. If we leave now, we'll get there in time for the opening acts tonight. The drive from Dallas to Austin was familiar territory. They'd made this trip multiple times for concerts and festivals. Interstate 35 was a straight shot south, with plenty of rest stops and familiar landmarks along the way. They'd been driving for about 2 hours when Emma spotted the figure by the side of the highway. "Ryan, slow down," she said, pointing ahead to where a young woman stood beside the guardrail. "There's someone who looks like they need help." In the glow of Ryan's headlights, they could see a girl who appeared to be in her early 20s, wearing a torn and stained prom dress in a shade of blue that had once been elegant but now looked tragic. Her dark hair was tangled and dirty, and she held one arm out with her thumb extended in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. "Emma, it's Halloween night on a busy highway," Ryan said, slowing but not stopping. "Every horror movie ever made starts with people picking up hitchhikers." "She looks hurt," Emma insisted. "What if she was in an accident? We can't just leave her here." Ryan's conscience got the better of his caution, and he pulled over about 50 feet past the hitchhiker. In his rearview mirror, he watched the young woman walk toward their vehicle with a graceful glide that seemed to cover ground faster than her steps should have allowed. "Thank you so much," the hitchhiker said, as she slid into the back seat. Her voice was soft and musical, with an accent that sounded vaguely southern, but from an era that was difficult to place. "I've been waiting for someone to stop for so long." "What happened to you?" Emma asked, turning around to get a better look at their passenger. Up close, the prom dress was clearly vintage, not a modern reproduction, but an actual gown from decades past. The fabric, despite being torn and stained, had the quality and craftsmanship of expensive formal wear from another era. "Car trouble," the hitchhiker replied with a sad smile. "I was coming home from a dance and my car just stopped working. I've been trying to get home ever since." "What's your name?" Ryan asked, adjusting his rearview mirror to see their passenger better. "Melody," she said. "Melody Patterson. I just need to get to Riverside Drive in Austin. Do you know where that is?" Emma pulled out her phone to check the location. "I can find it on GPS. We're heading to Austin anyway, so it's not a problem." But as Emma looked up the address on her mapping app, she noticed something that made her frown. Her phone showed no reflection of Melody in the camera when she accidentally activated the front-facing mode, though Emma could clearly see the hitchhiker sitting directly behind her. Ryan was having his own concerns. Despite having the windows open for ventilation, the car was filled with a smell that reminded him of fresh earth after rain, mixed with something sweet and organic that he couldn't identify. It wasn't necessarily unpleasant, but it was unusual and seemed to be coming from their passenger. "So what kind of dance were you at?" Emma asked, trying to make conversation. "Spring formal," Melody replied. "It was wonderful. Jimmy looked so handsome in his tuxedo, and we danced to all our favorite songs. It was supposed to be the most perfect night of my life." Emma and Ryan exchanged glances. Spring formal typically happened in April or May, not October, and Melody's prom dress, while beautiful, was definitely not appropriate for autumn weather. "Must have been a costume party," Ryan suggested diplomatically. Melody laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow carried an undertone of sadness. "In a way, I suppose it was. Everyone was dressed up, playing roles they thought they were supposed to play. But costumes can become permanent if you're not careful." As they drove through the night, Emma began noticing more disturbing details about their passenger. When they passed under highway lights, Melody didn't cast a shadow. When Ryan adjusted his mirrors, her reflection was either absent or distorted, showing glimpses of something much older and more decayed than the young woman sitting in their back seat. Most unsettling was Melody's knowledge about their destination. Despite never being told where they were going, she began making comments about the music festival they were attending. "You'll love the third act on the main stage," she said. "They play that song about lost love that always makes everyone cry." "How do you know what bands are playing?" Emma asked. "I've been to this festival many times," Melody replied. "Different years, different people, but always the same music. Always the same stories about young people trying to find their way in the world." Ryan was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with their passengers' cryptic responses and impossible knowledge. When he tried to engage her in more specific conversation, Melody's answers became vague and dreamlike, as if she were recalling events from a great distance in both time and memory. As they approached Austin, Emma used her phone's GPS to navigate to the Riverside Drive address Melody had provided. But the directions led them to a location that made Emma's blood turn cold. "This can't be right," she muttered as they turned into the entrance of Oakwood Cemetery. "This is perfect," Melody said cheerfully. "Thank you both so much for the ride. I haven't been home in such a long time." Emma and Ryan watched in shock as their passenger walked gracefully among the weathered headstones, her blue prom dress flowing behind her like water. She approached a particular grave marker and knelt down, placing her hand on the stone with obvious affection. "We have to follow her," Emma whispered. Against Ryan's better judgment, they got out of the car and approached the headstone where Melody knelt. In the pale moonlight, they could read the inscription carved into the granite, "Melody Patterson, 1969, 1987, beloved daughter, dancing in heaven now." Below the main inscription was additional text, "Killed in automobile accident returning from spring formal, May 15, 1987. "Thank you for bringing me home," Melody said without turning around. "I've been hitchhiking this route for 36 years, trying to get back to my resting place. Most people don't stop, and those who do usually get too frightened to complete the journey." Emma realized with growing horror that they had given a ride to someone who had been dead for over 3 decades. Someone who spent eternity trying to return to her grave after dying in a car accident on what should have been the most perfect night of her life. "We should go," Ryan said, backing toward their car, but Melody stood and turned to face them, and Emma could see that her appearance was changing. The beautiful young woman in the prom dress was becoming something older and more tragic, a girl who had been waiting far too long to find peace. "I have a different request this time," Melody said, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "Instead of just giving me a ride, I'd like you to stay and keep me company. 36 years is a very long time to spend alone, and I've grown tired of hitchhiking the same highway over and over." The temperature around them dropped dramatically, and Emma could see her breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Around them, other headstones began to glow with a faint light, as if the entire cemetery were awakening. "We can't stay," Emma said, though she found herself unable to move toward their car. "We have lives, families, plans." "So did I," Melody replied sadly. "I had college applications pending, a summer job lined up, a boyfriend who was planning to propose after graduation. But sometimes plans change, and sometimes the best thing you can do is help someone who's been lost for far too long." As Emma and Ryan felt their life force being drawn toward the lonely spirit who had waited decades for companions, they understood that some hitchhikers aren't looking for transportation to their destination. They're searching for friends willing to share the journey that never ends. Their Halloween road trip to the music festival would become a very different kind of eternal celebration, with music that only the dead could hear, and dancing that lasted far longer than any earthly party. Sarah and Tom Mitchell had been driving Route 129 through the Smoky Mountains for 15 years of marriage, and the scenic highway had become their favorite way to celebrate their wedding anniversary. This Halloween marked their anniversary weekend, and they'd planned a romantic getaway at the same mountain resort where they'd honeymooned. "Remember our first trip on this road?" Sarah said as Tom navigated the familiar curves that wound through the mountain forest. "You were so nervous about the hairpin turns that you drove 15 miles under the speed limit." Tom laughed at the memory. "And you kept reading me statistics about mountain driving accidents from that guidebook. We were both terrified we'd end up as one of those couples who never made it to their destination." The autumn foliage was spectacular this year, with maple and oak trees displaying brilliant reds and oranges that glowed like fire in their headlights. They'd timed their departure to arrive at the resort just after sunset, when the mountain views would be at their most dramatic. But 20 minutes into their journey, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. "Tom, didn't we just pass that scenic overlook about 10 minutes ago?" Tom glanced in his rearview mirror. "Which overlook? They all look similar at night." "The one with the stone wall and the historical marker about the Cherokee Trail. I remember reading the sign when we passed it earlier." Tom slowed down, trying to spot the landmark Sarah was describing. "I don't think we passed any historical markers tonight. Maybe you're thinking of a previous trip." But as they continued driving, Sarah became increasingly certain they were encountering landmarks in the wrong order. She remembered details from countless trips on this route, and tonight the familiar sights were appearing backwards. Destinations they should see at the end of their journey were showing up at the beginning. "There's the covered bridge," Sarah said, pointing ahead to a structure that spanned a creek beside the highway. "But that's supposed to be only 5 miles from the resort. We can't be that close already." Tom checked the odometer and his GPS, both of which confirmed they'd been driving for less than 30 minutes. The covered bridge should indeed have been much further along their route. "Maybe they built a new bridge," Tom suggested, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Or maybe I'm more familiar with this road than I thought, and I'm driving faster than usual." As they crossed the covered bridge, Sarah noticed something that made her skin crawl. The road signs they were passing appeared to be written backward, as if she were reading them in a mirror. The letters looked normal at first glance, but when she focused on them carefully, she realized they were reversed. "Tom, something's wrong," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Look at that speed limit sign." Tom glanced at the sign she indicated and felt his stomach drop. The numbers appeared normal, but something about them seemed off, as if they were reflected images rather than direct text. More disturbing was the oncoming traffic. Cars were approaching them from the opposite direction, their headlights growing brighter as they neared. But when the vehicles should have passed them, they simply vanished as if they'd never existed. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked after a pickup. Truck's headlights had disappeared without the vehicle actually passing them. "See what?" "That truck that was coming toward us. It just disappeared." Tom hadn't noticed the vanishing traffic, but he was becoming aware of more subtle wrongness in their familiar journey. The mountain curves seemed to be flowing in reverse, unfolding in mirror image of the route he knew so well. Sarah began testing her suspicions by recalling specific memories associated with landmarks along their route. As they passed each familiar site, she found herself remembering not their most recent encounters with these places, but progressively older memories. "The old mill," she said as they drove past a historical site they'd visited many times. "I'm remembering our 10th anniversary, when we stopped there for photos. But I should be thinking of last year's trip, not 5 years ago." Tom was experiencing something similar, a strange telescoping of memory where recent events felt distant and older memories seemed immediate and vivid. "This is the spot where we had our first fight as a married couple," he said as they passed. "A scenic pullout." "But that was 14 years ago. Why am I thinking about that instead of the conversation we had here last year?" Sarah realized with growing horror that they weren't just driving through space, they were traveling backward through time, retracing every trip they'd ever taken on this route in reverse chronological order. Each mile brought them closer to older versions of themselves and earlier stages of their relationship. Tom began forgetting details about their recent life while recalling conversations from their early marriage with perfect clarity. "Do you remember buying the house?" Sarah asked, testing the extent of their temporal displacement. Tom paused, his expression confused. "What house? We're still in the apartment, aren't we? The one near the university where you're finishing your degree?" Sarah realized that Tom's memories were reverting to their life from over a decade ago, when they'd been newlyweds living in student housing. But she could still remember their current life, the house, Tom's promotion, the children they'd discussed, but never had. The road continued unfolding in reverse, taking them past landmarks that corresponded to even earlier memories. Sarah saw the place where Tom had proposed, the overlook where they'd had their first kiss, the scenic area where they'd met during a college hiking trip. With each milestone, Tom's memories regressed further into the past. Soon he was remembering Sarah as his girlfriend, then as his classmate, then as a stranger he'd just met. "I'm sorry, but do I know you?" Tom asked as they approached the mountain overlook where they'd first spoken to each other 15 years earlier. Sarah understood, now that the road had become a temporal loop, unraveling their entire relationship in reverse chronological order. Someone or something wanted to change a specific moment in their past, but reaching that moment meant erasing everything that had happened since. As they arrived at the exact spot where they'd first met as college students, Sarah realized they were trapped in a cycle where their love story would be undone and rewritten over and over by forces that believed some relationships deserved different endings. The mountain road stretched endlessly ahead, leading them backward through time, to moments that would be revised until they became strangers who had never fallen in love, never married, never shared the 15 years of happiness that were being systematically erased. Some scenic routes don't just show you beautiful views, they show you all the paths your life might have taken, and sometimes they insist on taking you down the roads you didn't choose. Alex and Danny Kowalski hadn't spoken to each other in 3 years, not since their father's funeral had ended with a bitter argument about family responsibilities and old resentments. But when their childhood home was scheduled for demolition, both brothers felt compelled to make one final visit to the place where they'd grown up. Halloween night seemed appropriate for this melancholy pilgrimage. The house where they'd spent their youth would be torn down the following week to make way for a shopping center, and neither brother wanted to face the goodbye alone, despite their unresolved differences. "Thanks for coming," Alex said awkwardly as Danny climbed into his pickup truck. "I know things have been complicated between us. It's just one night," Danny replied, settling into the passenger seat with obvious discomfort. "We look at the house, say goodbye, and then we can go." Back to not talking to each other. The drive from their respective homes to their childhood neighborhood normally took about 2 hours, following interstate highways through familiar suburban areas. Alex had made this journey countless times over the years, visiting their parents and maintaining connections to the place that had shaped him. About 30 minutes into their trip, Alex's radio began picking up a local news broadcast that made both brothers pause. Tragic traffic accident on Interstate 40 has claimed the lives of 2 brothers traveling to visit their family home, the news anchor reported in the matter-of-fact tone of established journalism. Alex Kowalski, 34, and Daniel Kowalski, 31, were killed when their vehicle left the roadway and struck a tree near mile marker 127. The accident occurred at approximately 11:45 p.m. on Halloween night. Alex nearly swerved off the road as he heard their names broadcast over the radio. "What the hell was that?" "Some kind of prank," Danny said, though his voice carried uncertainty. Maybe someone hacked the radio station as a Halloween joke. But as they continued driving, every station they tuned to carried the same news report, all describing the same fatal accident involving the Kowalski brothers. The details were unnervingly specific: their ages, their destination, even personal. Information about their estranged relationship and the purpose of their final trip together. The brothers had been traveling to their childhood home, scheduled for demolition, when they lost control of their vehicle during an apparent argument about family issues that had divided them since their father's death. The radio continued. "How do they know about our fight at the funeral?" Danny asked. "We never talked to anyone about that." Alex tried changing stations, but found the same broadcast on every frequency. AM, FM, even the emergency channels were carrying identical reports of their deaths. The news anchors provided details that no random DJ should have known about their family history, their personal lives, or their reasons for making this trip. Alex Kowalski, an insurance adjuster from Columbus, had been attempting to reconcile with his younger brother, Daniel, a construction foreman from Cincinnati. The broadcast continued. Family members report that the brothers had not spoken since a dispute over their father's estate 3 years ago. "That's not even accurate," Alex muttered. "We didn't fight about the estate. We fought about Dad's medical care." But even as he spoke, Alex realized the radio reports were adapting in real time to their conversation. The next news update corrected. the earlier version. Sources now indicate the brothers' estrangement began with disagreements about their father's medical care, rather than financial issues. Danny grabbed the radio dial and spun through every available frequency, but each station carried the same death report with increasingly graphic details about the accident scene, the condition of their bodies, and the investigation into what had caused them to lose control of their vehicle. The fatal crash occurred near mile marker 127, the broadcast repeated. Emergency responders found evidence of excessive speed and possible driver distraction in the moments leading up to the accident. Alex checked their current location and felt his blood turn cold. They were approaching mile marker 125, only 2 miles from the predicted crash site. "We need to get off this highway," Danny said, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine fear. "Take the next exit, any exit." But when Alex tried to change routes, taking exit ramps and alternate roads, the radio reports adapted to their new path. The crash location updated in real time, always positioning their predicted death just ahead of their current location. The accident has now been relocated to Route 23 near the Riverside Drive overpass, came a new broadcast as they turned onto a surface street. "This is impossible," Alex said, but his voice carried the hollow quality of someone whose disbelief was crumbling in the face of inexplicable evidence. The radio began providing even more personal details, describing conversations the brothers had had years earlier, private thoughts they'd never shared with anyone, and family secrets that should have died with their parents. Alex Kowalski had been struggling with guilt over missing his father's final hospital visit, the broadcast revealed. Daniel Kowalski blamed his brother for their father's isolation in his final months, though both men shared responsibility for the family's fractured relationships. "How do they know that?" Danny whispered. As they drove through the night, desperately trying to avoid the predicted accident location, the brothers began to understand that they weren't listening to prophecies. They were hearing reports from a timeline where their deaths had already occurred. The radio signals were bleeding through from an alternate reality where the Kowalski brothers had died in a traffic accident, and that reality was trying to merge with theirs. The investigation revealed that the brothers had been arguing about their father's last words when Alex lost control of the vehicle. The broadcast continued. Family members report that their father had tried to reconcile his sons before his death, but his message was never delivered due to their ongoing estrangement. "What message?" Alex and Danny said simultaneously, neither having heard about any final message from their father. The radio provided an answer that stopped both brothers' hearts. Harold Kowalski's final words were recorded by hospital staff. "Tell my boys I forgive them both, and I hope they can forgive each other. Life's too short for grudges." As they approached their childhood home, Alex and Danny realized that the radio prophecies weren't trying to cause their deaths. They were trying to prevent them. The broadcasts were warnings from a timeline where the brothers had died without reconciling, never learning that their father had forgiven them both and hoped they could forgive each other. Some radio signals carry more than music and news. They carry messages from alternate realities where people made different choices, and sometimes those messages arrive just in time to change the ending. Carol Stevens and Lisa Park had been friends for 25 years, ever since they'd met as college freshmen and bonded over late-night study sessions and dreams of changing the world. Now, in their mid-40s, they'd maintained their friendship, despite living in different cities, different careers, and the inevitable complications of adult life. Their Halloween road trip was a nostalgic journey designed to recapture some of the spontaneous adventure that had defined their youth. They planned to drive from Atlanta to Nashville, revisiting locations from their college years, dive bars where they'd celebrated passing exams, scenic overlooks where they'd had heart-to-heart conversations about their futures, and the small towns where they'd spent spring breaks exploring local culture. "Remember when we thought we'd conquer the world by 30? Lisa said as Carol navigated onto Interstate 75 North. "We were going to be famous journalists, travel the globe, write the stories that would change everything." Carol laughed, though there was a note of wistfulness in her voice. "Instead, I'm a suburban mom writing marketing copy, and you're a small-town newspaper editor covering school board meetings. Not exactly the Pulitzer Prize material we imagined. But we're still us, Lisa replied. Still friends, still dreaming, just with more realistic expectations about deadlines and mortgages. The first hour of their journey passed pleasantly, with classic rock playing on the radio and familiar conversation about their families, careers, and shared memories. Interstate 75 was a route both women had traveled numerous times, and they settled into the comfortable rhythm of a road trip between old friends. But as they passed the 200-mile marker, something began to feel wrong. Didn't we just pass this exit? Carol asked, pointing to a highway sign for a town called Valdosta. We passed Valdosta about an hour ago, Lisa replied, checking the paper map she'd brought out of habit. We should be well into Tennessee by now. Carol glanced at her odometer and GPS, both of which confirmed they'd been driving for over 3 hours. But the highway signs suggested they were still in Georgia, passing the same exits they'd seen at the beginning of their trip. Maybe there's another Valdosta, Carol suggested, though she didn't sound convinced by her own explanation. 20 miles later, they passed another familiar exit, the same rest stop where they'd made a bathroom break during their first hour on the road. Carol was certain they were seeing the same buildings, the same landscaping, even the same fast food restaurants. I'm going to pull over, Carol said, her voice tight with concern. Something's definitely wrong here. The rest stop looked identical to the one they'd visited earlier, down to the same maintenance worker emptying trash cans and the same family walking their dog in the designated pet area. But when Carol and Lisa approached the building, they found that the doors were locked and the windows were dark, despite the fact that people appeared to be moving around inside. Their fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, exactly the same reading it had displayed for the past 2 hours despite continuous highway driving. The clock on Carol's dashboard was stuck at 11:47 p.m., and their cell phones showed no signal despite being in an area that should have had excellent coverage. We're in some kind of loop, Lisa said as they returned to the car. The highway is repeating itself, showing us the same mile markers and exits over and over. They decided to conduct an experiment, paying careful attention to specific landmarks and highway features. Over the next hour, they confirmed their suspicions. Interstate 75 was cycling through the same 100-mile stretch repeatedly, resetting to mile marker 200 every time they reached mile marker 300. Other vehicles appeared sporadically on the highway, but they weren't normal traffic. Carol and Lisa saw a school bus filled with children whose faces were pressed against the windows, all waving with identical smiles that never changed expression. A motorcycle roared past them without a visible rider, its engine running at impossible speeds. Most unsettling was a convoy of military vehicles from what appeared to be World War II, olive-drab trucks and jeeps that shouldn't have existed on modern civilian highways. The soldiers in the vehicles wore period uniforms and carried equipment that belonged in a museum, but they waved at Carol and Lisa as if their presence on Interstate 75 was perfectly normal. We're not just in a loop, Carol realized as they passed the same mile markers for the 4th time. We're in some kind of collection. This highway is gathering vehicles from different time periods. Lisa noticed that their car was beginning to show signs of age that corresponded to their time on the endless highway. The upholstery was fading, the radio was picking up stations that played music from earlier decades, and their personal belongings were taking on the worn quality of items that had been traveling for much longer than a few hours. How long have we been driving? Lisa asked, though the question seemed increasingly meaningless in a place where clocks didn't work and distance had no relationship to time. Carol found that she was having difficulty remembering their lives outside the highway. Her job, her family, her house. All of these things seemed distant and unreal compared to the immediate experience of driving the same stretch of road repeatedly. Maybe this is better, Carol said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. No deadlines, no responsibilities, just us and the road like we always talked about when we were young. Lisa understood that the endless highway was more than just a supernatural phenomenon. It was a trap for people who were dissatisfied with the destinations their lives had reached. The interstate was offering them the eternal journey they'd dreamed about in college, where the adventure never had to end because they never had to arrive anywhere. Their car radio began picking up broadcasts from different eras, news reports from the 1940s, music from the 1960s, talk shows from the 1980s. The programming seemed to come from all the vehicles that had been collected by the endless highway over the decades. "This is Highway Patrol dispatch to all units on I-75, came a voice that sounded like it belonged to the 1970s. "We have multiple reports of vehicles disappearing between mile markers 200 and 300. Advise extreme caution in that sector." "Carol and Lisa from Atlanta," came another voice, this one contemporary. "This is Margaret and Sue from Birmingham. We've been driving this same stretch for 3 days now. Don't try to get off. The exits just lead back to the highway." The friends realized they were part of a community of travelers who had been collected by Interstate 75's supernatural loop. All people who had been driving together when they encountered the phenomenon, all gradually forgetting their reasons for wanting to reach specific destinations. "We were going to Nashville," Carol said, though the words felt increasingly hollow. "We were going to visit our old college hangouts." "Were we?" Lisa replied. "Or were we just looking for an excuse to drive together and remember when we thought the journey was more important than the destination?" As their car settled into its permanent position in the endless convoy of lost travelers, Carol and Lisa understood that they had found exactly what they'd been looking for without realizing. The interstate wasn't keeping them from their destination. It was providing them with the eternal road trip they'd dreamed about in their youth, where friendship and adventure mattered more than arriving anywhere specific. Some highways don't just connect destinations. They preserve the journeys that people aren't ready to finish, creating eternal road trips for travelers who discover that getting there is only half the fun. Marcus Thompson had been driving for rideshare companies for 3 years, and Halloween night was always his most profitable shift. College students in elaborate costumes, partygoers who'd had too much to drink, and people attending multiple Halloween events throughout the night. Everyone needed rides, and most were generous with tips when they were in festive moods. The request that came through his app at 11:23 p.m. seemed routine enough. Pick up at the corner of 5th and Maple, destination across town near the University District. The passenger rating was 5 stars, though Marcus noticed the profile had no photo and very few previous rides, not unusual for people who only used rideshare services occasionally. Marcus arrived at the designated pickup location and immediately spotted his passenger waiting on the corner. The figure wore an elaborate mask that appeared to be professionally crafted, not a cheap store-bought costume, but the kind of detailed work that belonged in a theater or film production. The mask seemed to shift in Marcus's peripheral vision, appearing to be a different design each time he glanced at it. Sometimes it looked like a traditional comedy mask with an exaggerated smile, sometimes like a tragedy mask with downturned mouth, and occasionally like something much more disturbing, with too many teeth and eyes. "Good evening," the passenger said as they slid into the back seat. Their voice was muffled by the mask but carried an odd quality that suggested it was coming from much deeper in their throat than normal speech should originate. "Great costume," Marcus said, adjusting his rearview mirror to get a better look at his fare. "Must have cost a fortune to get something that elaborate." The passenger didn't respond to the compliment, and Marcus noticed they hadn't provided a destination address through the app. "Where are we heading tonight?" "Surprise me," came the muffled reply. "I'm in no hurry to get anywhere specific." Marcus was accustomed to passengers who were indecisive about destinations, especially on Halloween when people were often moving between multiple parties. He began driving toward the university area, figuring he could get more specific directions along the way. But as he drove through the city, Marcus began to notice disturbing things about his passenger's reflection in the rearview mirror. The mask appeared to be breathing independently, expanding and contracting as if something underneath was taking deep, deliberate breaths. More unsettling, the mask's expression seemed to be changing in response to Marcus's thoughts, rather than to any conversation they were having. "So what's your story tonight?" Marcus asked, trying to maintain the friendly customer service demeanor that had earned him consistently high ratings. "Big party? Meeting friends?" Instead of answering directly, the passenger began communicating through Marcus's radio. The music cut out, replaced by fragments of different songs and advertisements that, when heard in sequence, formed coherent responses to Marcus's questions. "Looking for someone special, came the message, assembled from snippets of different radio programs. Someone to take me home forever. Marcus found this communication method unsettling, but he'd driven enough drunk college students to know that people in costumes often like to stay in character. "Well, I can definitely get you home," he said. "Just need to know where home is." The radio responded with an address that Marcus recognized as being in one of the city's oldest neighborhoods, an area filled with Victorian houses that had been converted into apartments and rental properties. He adjusted his route and continued, driving. But as they traveled through the city, Marcus noticed that his mirrors were beginning to show reflections of places he'd never been. Instead of the familiar streets he was driving through, his rearview mirror displayed images of empty highways, abandoned buildings, and landscapes that looked like they belonged in different seasons or even different decades. "Are you from around here originally?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect his passenger wasn't from around anywhere that still existed on current maps. "Been traveling for very long time," came the radio response. "Many drivers, many cities, always searching." The temperature in Marcus's car began to drop, and he could see his breath forming clouds despite the fact that his heater was running. The passenger's presence was somehow drawing warmth from the vehicle's interior. More disturbing was the gradual change in Marcus's own reflection. When he glanced in his mirrors, he appeared increasingly translucent, as if his physical presence was being drained away and transferred to the entity in his back seat. "What exactly are you searching for?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to fear the answer. "Someone willing to trade places," the radio spelled out with increasing clarity. "Driver becomes passenger. Passenger becomes driver." Marcus tried to pull over but discovered that his hands wouldn't obey his conscious commands. The steering wheel was turning on its own, following routes that Marcus hadn't chosen and leading him through parts of the city he didn't recognize despite having lived there for years. His rideshare app showed that the trip was still in progress, but the destination had changed to an address that didn't appear to exist on any map. The estimated arrival time kept counting down, but they never seemed to get closer to wherever they were supposed to be going. "This isn't how rideshare works," Marcus said, his voice shaking as he realized he was no longer in control of his own vehicle. "I provide transportation from point A to point B. I don't trade places with passengers. Every driver eventually needs to become passenger." The radio explained with what might have been patience. "Every traveler eventually needs rest." Marcus understood that the entity in his back seat wasn't looking for transportation to a specific location. It was searching for someone willing to take over the eternal journey that it had been making for decades, perhaps centuries. As Marcus felt his humanity being drained away and his consciousness merging with the vehicle itself, he realized he was becoming part of the rideshare system in a way he'd never imagined. He would continue driving, picking up passengers, following the directions provided by an app that connected riders to drivers across multiple dimensions of existence. The entity that had been his passenger was now settling into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors to reflect its new perspective on the road ahead. It would use Marcus's profile, his vehicle, and his accumulated customer ratings to continue the search for its next replacement. Some rideshare requests come from passengers who have been traveling much longer than any GPS system can calculate, and some destinations can only be reached by people willing to trade their role as driver for the permanent position of passenger in vehicles that travel between worlds that most people never see. Marcus's last conscious thought was the realization that his 5-star rating would help the entity find many more unsuspecting drivers willing to accept pickup requests that led to much more than just a ride across town.